Hello, everybody, and welcome to Dev Talks. I'm Diane Davis, and I'm the Charles Dyer Norton Professor of Regional Planning and Urbanism at the Graduate School of Design, that ugly brutalist building. We're not going to talk about that design today. Over near Sanders Theater, I'm also a faculty at the GSD. I'm a faculty in the Department of Urban Planning and Design. And I work extensively on relations between urbanization and development in Latin America and other global South contexts. So I'm really excited to be here, and I know Alain's work. But thank you all for inviting me to moderate this session. It's my great honor to welcome Alain Bertaud for a session that will largely revolve around his book, which I brought, if you haven't seen it, if you haven't read it yet, Order Without Design, How Markets Shape Cities. So, and I should also say, in the interest of full disclosure, I sent Alain some of the questions, but there's some surprise questions. Let's see if he's flustered at all by any of them. I doubt it. So we'll start with a few of them that he's already gotten, just to get us moving in the conversation today. So the first one, and I'm going to dive in and start really simply asking him, what motivated you to write this book? It seems that with all your experience, we might have seen a book like this from you even earlier than 2018. So is it owing to your own personal trajectory, or shall I say the state of the world? That is, would you think there's an urgent need to align planners and urban economists today, perhaps because of certain challenges or recent developments in the world?
Well, first, thanks for inviting me here. We're very happy to have an audience. And why did I write this book, and why so late in my career? It's kind of it's a swan song in a certain way, probably, because I was busy doing things, and I had this book over 20 years. Actually, I had notes, but I never had time to finish it, and it's only when I met Paul Romer at NYU, 10 years ago, 11 years, no, 10 years ago now, that he convinced me that, I wanted this note to be a little chapter that I will put on the web, like I put some of my report. And he convinced me that if I wanted to have an impact, that I have to publish a book, a paper book through a regular publisher. And I thought that it will take too much time for me, but he stimulated me to do that, and he organized every 2 weeks at NYU a kind of informal group that he will assemble about 10, 12 people to discuss chapters of my book one by one, and that was really extremely stimulating. And so I finished my book then in 5 years when I was at NYU under this, again, intellectual stimulant, right. Which again, the idea of my book is that it's people you meet in cities which are important. Uh-huh. It was not the building of NYU or the sewer system or something.
Great. We'll come back to New York City in a little while. But so my second question is the idea at the heart of the book, and feel free to correct me if my reading of the book is not exactly what your reading of the book is. Yes. But the idea at the heart of the book is that planners and urban economists need to work together, but they frequently, if not all the time, do not. Although we do have urban economists over in the GSD, so in the urban planning program. So you identify a series of explanations for this. For example, you argue that while planners are driven by normative values and qualitative understandings of cities, urban economists rely more on quantitative methods, empirical reasoning, and science. Can you summarize your argument for the audience here? And perhaps frame it, and this is where I'm going to add you to embellish a bit, frame it in terms of the fact that planners may see themselves as having different clients, if you will, such as working for citizens or even the state, while economists may be trying to ensure that market dynamics are working efficiently and thus have an ephemeral client of sorts without the direct relationship or accountability. So, and might the fact that they might have different clients have a bearing on how and for what reason they would not work well together?
I don't I don't think it's a difference of client. I think that planners usually have a background either like me as architect. By the way, you introduced me as an economist. I learned economist on my own. You know, and some of my colleagues at the World Bank call me a feral economist. You know, but you know, so I learned on the spot, and I never had a. So economists try to understand how things work. Mm-hmm. Planners, architects, or people who are involved in cities would like to invent something new. They think that they are dissatisfied with cities, and we all are. There are always something which doesn't go well. And they think, well, if we rearrange cities this way, everything will be fine. Uh-huh. They are not so much interested how the city works right now. They are just interested in something better, that, you know, in a certain way. Sometimes they think they compare themselves, you know, they see, for instance, an iPhone, which is a wonderful object, and they say we could design a city the way an iPhone is, you know, a smartphone is designed. And of course, they forget that every 2 or 3 years we throw away our iPhone and we buy another one, which is completely different. And the function of an iPhone also is relatively clear, where a city, again, I get back to my original ideas, is made of the people who are there. And those people have priorities and are making trade-offs, which are unpredictable, which are very different. You know, an average doesn't give you anything. So it's only by observing the way people act and will act in the future, which is unpredictable too, the spontaneous order, that you can develop an infrastructure which allows this city to work. So you see, these two, I don't think that it's so much the idea of the clientele. Now, my criticism of economists is that they tend to speak to each other. They use a jargon which is useful. I think when you talk about professional, jargon is useful because it's a shortcut. You know, it's faster to use jargon, but that means that you don't reach many. You know, you don't reach a mayor with jargon or a municipal council. So, and they tend to, because they are very quantitative, they will shy away of problems which do not have already a database, which is built on. So, for instance, they will, let's say, if they want to discuss rent control, they will be delighted to take case where rent control has been applied and very cleverly compared, you know, other areas which have no rent control and come with a very convincing paper. But if a mayor or city council say, why don't we establish rent control in this city, and they start discussing it, economists will not participate in general, unfortunately. So what I would like them is to participate at the moment where rent control is being discussed, not after it has been implemented.
That's really, I'm just like, I want to deviate already from my questions because you've got such great answers. Let me just make a comment, and I won't belabor it, but I've been teaching the kind of history and theory of urban planning over at the GSD. I have some of the students are here, and we've just had a long discussion in the last couple of weeks. Again, I mentioned I'm trained as a sociologist, about the Chicago School of Sociology and the influence of that on the kind of profession of urban planning, the interest in communities, looking, and out of the Chicago School comes both quantitative census data that kind of reframes and creates the basis for theory, and then that gets reified. So in other words, there's an interest in community, but the interest in the quantitative documentation of that prevents often economists from getting down to the dynamism of communities and how people live in them. So I'm thinking very much that you're really calling out, oh, and also in the Chicago School, the more kind of data analytics type are thinking about the city like an organism, like a machine, where you need data to understand how it's working or not working. So I see your work is really engaging in these age-old debates that have plagued our field and that plague all of us who study cities. At what point is data helpful, or at what point the search for data gets in the way of solving contemporary problems?
I think data is absolutely necessary and more than useful. But let's say what I reproach economists is to look at existing data where we can collect data, especially now with the technology there. There's a lot of data actually which are there, which will explain to us how a city works, and we don't quite know how to use this data yet.
Yeah.
And so I think that we should look forward, monitoring what is happening, understanding how a city works is absolutely essential, and we can do that only through data. But that's different from writing a paper published in a journal and which use past data, let's say, to make a point.
I mean, that's really important because in cities, just to paraphrase what you've said, new problems emerge that you haven't collected the data on yet. So you can't like wait until somebody else does that in order to solve those problems. And that leads to a question, one of my first new question that I didn't send you, but it's really building on everything you've already said, and it has to do with the temporality of the problems that we're looking at. So I'm like, you know, there are problems we don't have data on, but one could also say in the contemporary era, so there is, dare I say, an obsession. Surveillance capitalism is discussed here at the business school a lot, but there is an obsession with data, and all of a sudden there's almost maybe too much data. So there's a balance between not enough data and too much data. In other words, data is coming in all the time. So my question to you, having to do with the temporality of the problems, but also of kind of using data, the question is the failure of planners and urban economists to work together a long-standing problem? This is where time comes in. Or is it something that's new or perhaps more urgent now? Maybe urgent because of the availability or the desire to get more data? If it's a long-standing problem, why has it not been redressed, mediated, or resolved yet? And if it's new, why, and in what ways are the challenges of urban development different now than in the past? So really thinking about this, is you've been working for decades. This has been a problem for a while, but can you say something about the contemporary era and how it might be different?
Let's say, when I started my career, data was very difficult to get. There were maps were done, just to know even the extent of the city which was built. Maps were done through surveying, land surveying. It was very long. In many of the country I worked in, I had maps. I was using maps which were 50 years old. I remember doing the master plan of Karachi in 70. We had maps which were done by the British. There were no really updated maps so much. So we were from a stage where we had very few data. So we had to imagine what the data was. And that's, I think, why many planners were non-quantitative, because there were not much data. And to a point now, we have a surabundance of data, but I think all of them are important and useful, and we should use them. We have to use. Now, I agree with you that we have, I'm asked very often to review master plan or structure plan, or whatever they call them. And I found that there is a several volume of data. Then there are the recommendations at the end, and it's a complete non sequitur. The data, they're just there to give a little gravitas to, or maybe to add pages, I don't know, to the report. And there's a complete non sequitur. For instance, every master plan now talk about sustainability or equity. I have never seen something which will define what equity will be, in terms of outcome. Very often I don't see that. And therefore, that's why you have these non sequitur. At the end, they say, well, we believe in equity, and then, we believe that we should build a road there, or the floor ratio should be higher or lower, or something like that. There is no real relationship between the two. And I think this is what's wrong. I would like one day, when you have an objective, that you define exactly and you quantify, you say, after this plan is implemented, this group of people will consume more water or more education or more health. And that will convince me. But say, right now, again, we have this qualitative thing. I see that more a mantra that you put at the end of your planning thing, and you use the data to give you gravitas.
That's interesting. You brought up the issue of equity, and you're kind of raising questions about the importance of being able to measure it, not just talk about it as a normative value. One of the questions I sent you, which may be not relevant anymore, but was that one could say that one of the differences commonly assumed to differentiate urban economists from planners is the concern with maximizing efficiency versus enabling equity. You've already raised some important questions about how do we measure whether we're successful if we want to enable equity. I guess I wanted to know whether you think that's a fair characterization, that economists care more about efficiency and planners care more about equity.
No.
Okay. Say a little bit more about, maybe give an example of some of the work that you've done to.
No, I think that it's quite possible for an economist, if you define what equity is, to measure it.
Yeah.
And to establish what data you need to quantify it. For instance, in my book, I have a graph of income distribution and consumption of housing, and I think you could define equity there. Is equity that below a certain consumption of housing, the government will provide the fund in order that everybody consume at least above this minimum. So this is, economists are able to work that way, you see, if you define it. But if it's just equity without defining what it is, I don't think anybody can fulfill it. So I don't think there's this dichotomy between efficiency, by the way. If something is not efficient, I mean, if transport is not efficient, that means if it takes you 2.5 hours to get to your job, I don't think there is an equity in that. You know, you could say, well, it's equitable because you have access to transport, but it will take you 2.5 hours to get to your job. So I don't think that there is this antinomy between equity and efficiency. I think it's the same, two aspects of the same problem.
Excellent. And I'm not going to get started on the Orange Line in Boston and how much time it takes if you're taking public transport to get anywhere. But I do want to follow up on this. I really like what you've said. And just kind of, again, we have students here from the GST, and I'm learning also from this conversation. But what I think I hear you suggesting is that one way that planners and urban economists can work together well, and they can, but they need some common task, is for planners who maybe are more, or those who are more qualitative, more grounded, dealing with the community, to come up with some ideas about how to define equity so it could be better measured. So they may have a deeper understanding of the barriers to equity, but how to translate that knowledge into something that can be quantified is, I think, what you're arguing. And I think that's a really great point. So let me ask you a question about the concepts, some of the concepts in your book, and coming back to your background as an architect. So in the book, I see that you do, well, I would like to hear your definition of planning or the role of planners, and whether a planner is the same as an urban designer. And I ask that because I'm at a school where we have a department of urban planning and design, but the urban design program is actually separate from the urban planning program. It has been the bane of my existence. When I was chair of the department, I always wanted those folks to talk together. But the point is, in this book, even in the title, you have design. You are an architect by training. You go back and forth between planning and design. And I'm just wondering if you could say a little bit more about how you see the kind of those two. Are they different professions, planning and design?
I think they are complementary professions. I regret very much that in my book, I don't talk about urban design. You know, where the use of design in the title is do not concern the design of building. It means without plan.
Master plans, yes.
Master plans, yeah. So I regret very much because I think we are dealing at different scale there. You know, the planning is a structure of a city. Urban design is what you do, you know, and the planning of the city is a separation between what is private, what is public. That's the first function of things. Where the market will play and where in the streets, or parks, the market will not play. So you need a lot of design, especially in the area which are public. And the quality of the design or the lack of quality of design can completely destroy a lot of things you are doing right in the planning. For instance, I will say access to a subway station, for instance, the contact between the subway station, the private sector, and the public realm, the way it is designed completely, you may have a subway system which works very well, but suddenly this access is not very well designed, or it's so that's, I think, those aspects. And unfortunately, I don't treat it at all, although I have observed it a lot, and I'm very, I think it's a very, very important function. The way, for instance, planners tend to measure the number of square meters of parks per inhabitant in city. This is, I think, completely irrelevant. Everything as to the quality of design of those parks. You could have, for instance, in Brasilia, I think you have the maximum number of square meter of park per inhabitant. Most of the parks are completely unusable. You never see anybody there. And to contrary, in Hong Kong or even in Washington Square in the Village in New York next to NYU, this park is wonderfully designed. But at the end, it's still the people. You could have a park like Washington Square, which is well designed. It is useful because people come to play music in it. It is useful because some people play chess in it. You could design a chessboard and everything else, and it could be full of drug addicts and syringes, and it will not fulfill its function of park. So the design is there, but it's only the people who make it useful.
I'm loving this conversation so far. Hopefully we can take it back to the GSD. I might mention, I'm going to ask you, just use the word scale when we're talking about urban design, and I can't agree with you more about it. You just can't do a master plan without understanding how people use space, what might enable or constrain them from using space. I want to make a quick point, and I'd like to invite you over, that there's a huge exhibition in the lobby of the GSD, if anybody's interested, on the Grand Paris Express, which won the Veronica Rudge Green Prize here this year at the GSD, and there's going to be a big event next week, and there's a beautiful exhibition, and really looking at that question about looking at the development of subway stops that link both the kind of the center, the peri-urban and the region together around infrastructure investment to kind of bring together people and space. But let me push you, well, not push you, just ask another version of this question about scale. Because at the GSD, we have faculty, practitioners in the design professions work at very different scales. Even over there are the people that work at the building scale, and then there are people that work at the street scale, and then there are people that work at the neighborhood scale, and then there's the city scale. And I'm not even mentioning the national scale. You and I both work on the global south. The national scale of regulation, as well as resources, financing, et cetera, is relevant for what happens in cities. So I guess I wanted to hear a little bit more about what are your thoughts about the most effective scale for producing equitable and prosperous cities. You're interested in cities as a whole. You also underscore that it's very hard, that will be my next question, to act on the scale of the city as a whole. But can you build on some of the things you were just saying and say a little bit more about scales of action and scales of operation, and the relation of planners and urban economists in thinking about the appropriate scales for intervention?
You have to act at every scale, from the micro scale, the way the door of a building is designed or a sidewalk is designed, to the macro scale, which means the relationship between cities.
Yeah.
There is no, if one scale is missing, you all think we may fail altogether. I will compare it to a building. I'm an architect, so that you may design a building very well, but if you fail to design the rebar in your thing will collapse. So the rebar is part of the design, although design is much more than just the rebar. So I think for a city, it's exactly the same thing. Every scale is important. And that's why every time with my wife, we worked in cities, we always try to build case studies, in order to understand, to go into the lowest, the lowest income part of the city, and to try to understand what people, this specific city, this specific family will get in terms of water or space at a certain scale. We need this micro scale, and then doesn't mean that after that we also look at the larger aspect of the city, including our our labor markets work at the scale of a metropolitan area. So you have to go on both scales. Now, should the same person do everything? Probably not, but they should communicate very clearly together. Yes, so I think that it's important to work at every scale, and details are important, but then the structure of a city is also very important. It's not enough to have the right size of sidewalk if you cannot move from one part of the metropolitan area to another in less than 1 hour.
Yeah, I can't agree with you more on this comment about you have to be able to work simultaneously or understand what's happening at multiple scales at the same time. This is a part of the problem. It's not just the problem of planners and economists over the GST. We have this problem. So I'm totally supportive. And I have several more questions, but I'm only going to ask one more. Or one more and a follow-up, and then I'm going to open it to the audience, because building on your point about speaking, just thinking about scales and city visions. So you mentioned in your book that you thought it was a mistake, and maybe I was reading it incorrectly, for mayors to take on grand visioning exercises. That's why it'll be interesting to see the Grand Paris Express exhibition. Anne Hidalgo was very central, but also working with architects, economists. Everybody worked together on that. And you also mentioned in the book about the failures of some of these utopian visions. Radiant City, Garden City, I would throw Red Vienna. We were talking about that in my class just last week. But that makes me think, if we want to think about the city as a whole, and it's not just a kind of an abstract utopian political project, you really need political actors that are pragmatic and engaged in the reality of politics and the city. And I teach classes on the politics of governance, and this is the area that I know most about and I'm a strong advocate for. So I wanted to hear a little more about what you saw as the role of politics and urban governance in city building. You do a little criticism, maybe thinking about the ways in which you go through some exercises about the planners or the urban economists and the mayor. None of them can do it alone, but I wanted to hear a little. Somebody has to be driving the train. So who needs to be driving the train? And do you think mayors can actually play that role?
I strongly object to the word vision. Vision is personal. An artist has a vision, a philosopher has a vision, a prophet has a vision. Fine. A mayor, to me, has to be a good janitor. And so he should not. If you have a vision, that means that the other people do not have vision. Yeah. I believe that individual entrepreneur or worker in a city all have a vision, and this is legitimate. But the mayor himself is there just to provide the infrastructure which supports the vision of those individuals. He should not have a vision himself. And he's not a prophet. He's not elected to impose his vision on other people. So maybe it's semantic. You could say vision is a word for a plan but words are important, and if words lose their meaning, then then I think it's influence. The word you use influence what you are doing, even if you use a different. So I think it's important. So take this example of a janitor. A good janitor. A good janitor knows when the heating, the thing has to be changed, or the elevator has to be maintained, and whether it's time to do the roof again and things like that. And I think that's the role of the mayor. And the mayor have to recognize that it is the inhabitants who are created the wealth of the city. It is not him or some genius guy that he recruits.
or her, Mayor
yeah, sorry.
Hidalgo and Mayor Wolf.
Yes, yes.
So I
yes.
totally, I really like that answer. I'm just going to have one mini follow question. I promised the last one. I very much hear what you're saying about being careful when we use the word vision, because you said you can use vision from below, but not a single vision like the mayor has it. And I'm going to share with you, again, because I'm really interested in cultivating some new knowledge to help our students in planning and urban design. But I wanted to say that at the end of my class, when I teach this urban governance and the politics of planning, I have an exercise that I assign students. I think you're gonna, hopefully you'll appreciate that, like your comments on it. I assign students, that's not their choice, to one of four groups that they have to be: activist, an elected official or a politician, a bureaucrat, and they don't like it, want to use that word, but that's like a planner working in government, or maybe you won't like this word either, a consultant or a technocrat. I throw those together, like somebody that works for McKinsey, maybe an urban economist that's not working for a client, maybe not. But anyway, I assign them to those four groups, and I ask them which sensibility is the most important. I ask them to defend the sensibility of that role as the most important role for a planner. So an activist, politician, technocrat, bureaucrat. And surprise, surprise, at the end of the exercise, the students always say we need all of those sensibilities, which leads us in my work and in my classes to think about planners as mediators. You use the word janitor to talk about the mayor, but could you kind of talk a little bit more about how not just that role of that everyone needs to take or mediate, who's mediating this, which is a different idea than a janitor. How does that happen? Where does that happen, and how does that happen? And that's my last question, so get ready for your questions next.
A city is made of two parts in a way. The inhabitants who have their own activities and their own invention, and then an infrastructure which is, so that is grassroots. And then an infrastructure which is top down, because again, just a pure market system will not give you a network of roads or subway or even a sewer system. You could have a sewer system privately operated, but the design itself within a metropolitan area has to be done by government. So you have these two things together. So the role of the planners or the people who manage the city is to monitor, monitor what the private, what the people are doing in terms of activity, the change, and the way they react. By the way, we haven't talked about that, about external shocks. Mm-hmm. Every city is submitted constantly to external shocks. And a city survives if it is able to adapt quickly and adjust their consumption or their way of working to those external shocks. So the planners who does the top-down thing has to adapt to what the people are doing, rather than, and this morning I gave several examples of that, instead of saying, well, we are going to develop a transport system, but in order for this transport system to work, we need the densities to be aligned along this thing or this thing. So that means you are going to redesign the entire, all the trade-off that very carefully those firms and households were doing. You are going to annul that by saying, well, for my light rail to work or my BRT, I need the people to live there and to have high density there and not here. That I think is completely wrong. As a planner, you have to say, this is the way the city is evolving. For instance, jobs are dispersing in the suburbs. I have to support that with a new type of transport system, which will allow the labor market to work. So you see, you need one person who is, kind of a maestro in an orchestra? I'm not so sure. I think that, again, the data to monitor what is happening is very important. But and especially to see how people adapt to shock. We have now this example with the COVID. We have this tug of war a bit between workers who want to work at home and the company who would like them to work at the office. We do not have to take part in that. We have to observe what is happening and transform and adjust our infrastructure to respond to whatever equilibrium results between this this tug of war. So in a way, I'm not sure we need a maestro.
Yes, I totally agree. And we're going to start asking questions. I just want to summarize, if I could say, the parallel with I'm totally aligned with your response, Alain. When I mentioned meteors, I guess I want to summarize this as it's not top down, whether it's planners or mayors or even economists. It's kind of a horizontality. How do you create relationships across these different sectors that, the transport planners versus the school planners versus the investments? And this is, again, a problem we have in the GST. Every place is very siloed with their professional expertise, but thinking a little bit more about the horizontal relationships that are important at the scale of the city, I think you've made that point in an extremely erudite way. And thank you so much. So here, questions. Please put your hand up if you have a question.
Thank you so much for coming to speak with us today. I'm curious whether you see the newest revolution in remote work, and then on a longer, more medium time span, we've seen ICT infrastructure popping up and being able to allow people to communicate and work together without all physically being together in a city center, the way the cities, their historical use has been. Do you see this as fundamentally changing the way cities are going to be designed, the need for cities for economic purposes, and so forth?
I am still at a point where I like to observe what's happening. If we look at the data, at least in the United States, we have sometimes contradictory data about different cities. I would like to learn more about it. But personally, I feel that remote work as an advantage, certainly, but face-to-face contact and the randomness of contact when you meet people in a university or on job, or even maybe in a bar, in a restaurant, this randomness is very valuable and could not be abandoned. I think that for people who are older, people like me, for instance, working remote is feasible because I have a long network of people. I may not, learn very much for the few years which are left to me. I think that for younger people who are not, will see their career evolve depending. It's very important to meet people again who are not necessarily in their field. And I think that you meet them usually at work. And so I think that this, yes, being able to work randomly 2 or 3 days a week will probably improve transport. Certainly, it could also improve housing, in a certain way, the supply of housing. But I don't believe that you can do away entirely with this face-to-face and the randomness, the randomness of contact. So you could conceive, of a labor market not being just within a metropolitan area, but worldwide. And for some jobs, this is what happened already for us. So the insurance industry had decentralized entirely the processing of data in different countries. So in a way, you had already this aspect of decentralization. But at the end, you still have workers somewhere who are processing data and who themselves need to evolve, maybe learn other things, and they will need to meet people.
I think we have Ricardo, and then there are 2 questions back there.
Yeah. If you were to summarize, like the biggest $500 bills lying on the ground, or the most significant mistakes that are made in the management of cities, that are preventing them from being better? What would be your, say, top three ideas or policy priorities or corrections of the policy framework that you would want to put on the table?
Well, the first thing is to consider that transport and housing are two separate sectors. I think they are the same sectors. They are two aspects of the same sector. Transport define, in fact, the supply of land which is available for housing and for jobs also. So it's a transport system will define it. So it controls the supply. On the other hand, housing is a shelter, of course, but it's a point of departure of commuting to work for those people who still commute to work. And that's, I think, is very, very often forgotten. We have seen that when we're discussing South Africa, the new policy, which the policy since the fall of apartheid was very successful in building a lot of houses of good quality. Let's face it, very good quality. It was, but in the wrong place. They were not bought. They means that people had a nice house, but no job at all. So it's not a very good bargain, frankly. So you see that this is, I think, the main thing. The other that I see is, again, trying to optimize one part of the infrastructure at the expense of everything else. And usually it's transport, but it could be something else. Imagine that if you wanted to, you could optimize a sewer system, make it much cheaper than what it is by precisely having the sewer plant right in the CBD, in the area which is the densest. It will reduce the cost of sewer very much. You don't want to do that because, again, if you optimize only one element of the infrastructure at the expense of everything else, you do not have an efficient city. An efficient city is to respect the trade-off that each individual is doing for location for their own house and for their enterprise for their jobs. And this trade-off, no planners have the knowledge of those trade-offs that are done. So because we do not have the knowledge, the only thing we can do is to monitor where people are locating, where jobs are locating, and trying to serve this, not to force them into a so-called optimum design.
Two questions there. First here, yeah, and then one in the.
Thank you for writing this wonderful book. My question is centered around evidence-based planning or data-driven governance. And you brought out the talk about randomness in cities. So with the vast amount of data that we have now, we understand that the data unearths a lot of diversity in the city and the diverse ways in which people interact with the built environment. But when we want to take this evidence to action, we often see that through the policy making process, some of this diversity is lost because bureaucrats often want to put, regression equations to derive some sort of results and then inform the policy. So, what would be your advice to, still utilize data but preserve that diversity into the policy that goes on for urban areas? Thank you.
It's a difficult question. Let me think.
It's to the heart of the book too, in a way.
Yes, you see, yes, as we have discussed, we have, you should in every policy proposal, you should also use some case studies, in order to get some flesh to the statistics. I think this is important. And again, I think the problem will be more easily solved. When you are talking about bureaucrats who kind of try to aggregate things, it's because also themselves are not convinced that what individual people are doing is legitimate. And they think that they have a vision or an optimum plan. And that if the people follow the order that this plan require, things will be better. So if you have this dichotomy, it doesn't matter what data you bring, in a certain way. They will still follow these things. I had an example in Indonesia where there was a bilateral assistance were providing a free light rail to the city of Jakarta. And they realized when they did the analysis that in order to be financially viable, they needed a certain density along the corridors. And so they asked the planning department, please allow or even force, you cannot force, but they thought the planner could force the density along the corridors, but prevent higher densities outside, because they realized that there was competition. People were locating in different area. And so you see, this is completely wrong. Although for their point of view, their job was to have a BRT and build it. It was the only way to get it financially viable. But that's not what it's all about. I have another example. Then it was the World Bank in the city of Da Nang. They asked me to have a look, and just before I arrived, I had the report of a transport engineer who was very competent, who had been there, but his terms of reference were not go to Da Nang and find what is the best transport system so people can get to their job faster. It was look at Da Nang and see where you can put a BRT, which is a completely different problem. And the guy was a very good engineer. So he showed that you could put the BRT only in high-income area because the roads were wide enough, and where the 70% of the people were workers, used motorcycle, and usually it was hilly, around the hills, and you could not even bring a regular bus in those areas. So he did the analysis and said, well, after you implement your BRT, if the high-income area want to take the BRT, they will save 5 minutes on their trip. But for the people using motorcycle, because as you know, the BRT creates a barrier, you cannot go across very easily. So their trip will be about 10 minutes longer. So that was, and nobody in the bank reacted to that in a certain way, saying, well, we really give the wrong terms of reference to this poor guy. And so you see, this is very common. So again, it's one of, of the example of something people do all the time.
No, we have one more question, but I just want to make one comment. It makes me think of this example of the World Bank and the BRT. Sometimes I tell my students, that planning can be just as technocratic as urban economics, and sometimes it falls into this pattern of being a solution in search of a problem.
Yeah.
That, we saw something worked in X place and let's do it there without getting to the specificity, whether it's with data, quantitative, qualitative, that you mentioned in the World Bank. So that's a super interesting problem. All of us, we need to think about. Just because you found a kind of a measure that deals with some of the problems you care about doesn't mean you can expand it everywhere, or that you should then formalize that as your profession. Kind of looking and making sure every place has a BRT, et cetera. But anyway, no.
Hi, thank you. One question that I have is, you sort of object to this idea of a quote unquote vision. And I want to dig more into that, because I definitely think that there does need to be visionary planning done. I think, for example, the example of the exhibition in the GSD with the Grand Paris, I think there was a vision there, and it was for a regional transit system. And I think in countries outside the United States, there is a greater emphasis on regional planning. So my question is, in the context of the United States, do you think that there does need to be more grand visioning, just because of the mass siloization of government bureaucracy in the United States? I think that almost stratifies different sectors of government in order to plan more effectively. So I think there does need to be a grand vision
I
in
think
certain
that
contexts.
here we have a dispute on semantics. I am not saying that you should not have somebody who say, hey, things will work better if we had, communication between this part of the region and the other. But to me, this is not a vision. This is just pure applying your skill. Does somebody, a baker who makes a very good croissant, has a vision? No, he's a very good baker. And I think that if you are a transport economist and you work with an economist or a labor economist, you can come up with things saying, you see, if we had this type of transport, because of this is the way now the labor is distributed, these things work better. We will remove, we will expand the labor market. We'll make it like so. This is not a vision to me. It's just doing your job. You could call it that way. That's what I believe really. That's the word vision in itself contains something which is parachute on top of people.
I'm sorry, I think we're going to have to end this extremely stimulating conversation. I'm going to make one more comment, as you could guess, but I wish we had another hour with you, Alain. This has just been an amazing discussion. I guess just getting back to the issue of visioning and maybe trying to linking that with scale. I think that I love the example, of course, of a baker making a croissant, but certain urban problems, and especially when we think of the city, are so complex, have so many elements. There are different sectors, as you mentioned. You can't think about housing without transit. We got to think about jobs. There are so many elements. And of course, a baker might have to have butter, flour, yeast, etc. But when we start thinking about the scale of the urban, that somehow or another to get all the right people talking about where you want to go, how you want to create that baguette or whatever. But if you're talking about the scale of a region, you might need to be able to articulate what that is that you're trying to create to get all those people on board. So next time we'll talk a little, and it speaks to scale, but also the complexity, the horizontal conversation that has to happen. Let me just end this by saying that we didn't even scratch the surface of all the amazing examples given in here. And I had a lot of questions about the global South versus the global North, the pandemic you brought up. There's so much more to learn from you, Alain. And so thank you so much for being here with us today.